The sky over New York City burned red. Thomas Harlan stood atop the crumbling remains of what was once a proud skyscraper, now reduced to shattered steel beams and scattered debris. Above, the massive dark silhouettes of Zalari warships blocked out the sun. Their sharp, angular designs cut through the sky, blotting out any hope of resistance. Earth's final stand had been brutal and swift, with the Zalari systematically dismantling every line of defense humanity could muster. Around him the sounds of battle echoed, a futile struggle as the Zalari ground forces swept through the city. Screams, gunfire, and the thunderous roars of the invaders created a symphony of despair. Yet, in the midst of it all, Thomas kept his gaze locked on the alien behemoth floating above the remains of Central Park. The Zalari mothership, the command center of the fleet, loomed, a terrible reminder of the power they wielded. He had to see it for himself. He had to see the end of Earth. A deep rumble shook the ground, and he turned to witness the last of the UN defense mechs, giant, human-piloted machines of war, fall to a towering Zalari soldier. The alien's armor was pitch black, its face hidden beneath an obsidian helmet. It swung a glowing plasma blade through the mech's torso, slicing it clean in two. The human pilot didn't even have time to eject. Thomas gritted his teeth, the cold tendrils of helplessness coiling around his chest. There was no more fight left. There was no more hope. Humanity's end was upon them. And yet, something inside him refused to break. Even as Zalari soldiers began closing in, weapons raised, Thomas straightened his back and met their gaze defiantly. "Engineer Thomas Harlan," a guttural voice growled, reverberating through the empty streets. He turned slowly, facing the Zalari commander. The alien stood nearly 10 feet tall, its frame covered in intricate armor etched with symbols of conquest. Its eyes, cold and unfeeling, glowed a deep crimson as it stared down at him. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse. "That's me." The commander's mandibles clicked in what could have been amusement. "You will come with us." Thomas knew resisting was pointless. Earth was finished. His people, his family, gone. But if he could buy even a sliver of time, if he could just find a way to hurt them. He allowed himself to be led away, his mind already spinning with plans. There was no longer anything left to lose. As the Zalari soldiers marched him through the rubble of New York, he glanced up one last time at the burning sky. The memory seared itself into his mind, a reminder of everything they had taken from him. If they wanted an engineer, they would get one. But he would make sure every ship he built would carry the seeds of the Zalari's downfall. 5 years later, Zalari Shipyards, Althora Nebula. The clang of metal against metal echoed through the cavernous shipyard, accompanied by the hum of plasma welders and the low thrum of power generators. Thomas moved silently between the rows of half-constructed warships, his face hidden beneath the helmet of a Zalari-designed exosuit. He wore the guise of a loyal worker, but underneath, he remained ever the captive, Earth's last remaining survivor. Model 72C's propulsion system is underperforming. Adjust the plasma coil alignments by 0.3 radians, Thomas ordered in a flat tone, handing the schematics to a Zalari technician. The alien glanced at him, its yellow eyes narrowing. "We are not accustomed to taking orders from humans," it hissed. "You're not accustomed to your systems failing either," Thomas shot back, holding the alien's gaze. "Make the adjustment." The technician grumbled but did as instructed, muttering curses in its guttural tongue. Thomas watched in silence, his expression betraying nothing. Each day was a battle of wills. To survive in this place, surrounded by enemies who saw him as little more than a tool, he had to tread carefully. But he was more than just a prisoner. He was the Zalari's prized engineer, kept alive only because his genius surpassed even their finest minds. For 5 long years, they had forced him to design warships, weapons, and defense systems, creations that would be used to further their conquests across the galaxy. Yet, each blueprint, each specification carried a hidden flaw, a microscopic weakness buried deep within the machinery. No one noticed. Why would they? The Zelari were arrogant, convinced of their superiority. They saw him as broken, defeated, someone to be used and discarded. But the flaws were there, waiting to be exploited. And if no one else could exploit them, his son would. He felt a pang of grief as he thought of Saria, the only Zelari he had ever trusted, the only one who had seen him as more than a tool. She had risked everything to be with him, defying her race, her duty, only to be punished for it. But before they were torn apart, she had made him a promise: to raise their child, to keep him safe until he could carry on his father's legacy. That child was the only reason Thomas kept going, the only reason he endured this endless torment. His son, the last hope for a revenge that would echo across the stars. "Engineer Harlan," a voice boomed over the intercom, jerking him from his thoughts. He turned sharply, suppressing the surge of hatred that boiled in his veins. The Zelari overseer, a hulking figure with glistening carapace armor, strode toward him. "The High Command has summoned you." "What do they want?" Thomas asked, keeping his voice neutral. The overseer's mandibles twitched. "Your designs have proven effective. They wish to reward you." Thomas felt a chill creep down his spine. A reward? That could mean only one thing. His usefulness was coming to an end. He forced a calm expression and nodded. Very well. He followed the overseer through the labyrinthine halls of the shipyard, his gaze flicking to the countless warships under construction. Massive dreadnoughts, nimble cruisers, each one bearing his designs. Each one built to be unstoppable, except for the hidden flaws that only he knew how to exploit. If the Zelari found out, if they realized what he had done. He clenched his fists. It didn't matter. Even if they killed him, even if they erased every trace of his existence, his son would know. Saria had the data crystal, the key to it all. One day, when the time was right, his son would rise, and then the Zelari would burn. They entered the High Command's chamber, a vast, circular room lined with towering figures of Zelari generals and admirals. Their eyes gleamed as they regarded him, but Thomas kept his head high. He would not bow. Not now. Not ever. "Engineer Harlan," one of them rasped, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your work has served us well. You have earned your freedom." Thomas's heart skipped. Freedom. The general's eyes narrowed. Yes, as in, you are no longer needed. A shock of realization hit him. They were going to kill him. Today, here, in this room. But even as the guards moved forward, plasma rifles raised, Thomas allowed himself a small, grim smile. His work was done. His son was out there, waiting. And the Zelari's doom was already written. They just didn't know it yet. 18 years later, Outer Rim Colony of Verlos 9. The night sky over Verlos 9 shimmered with the eerie glow of its two moons. In the quiet outskirts of the colony, hidden among the rocky outcroppings, a young Zelari male crouched in the darkness. His lean frame, wrapped in a simple dark cloak, blended seamlessly with the shadows as he studied the bustling colony below. But this was no ordinary Zelari. With a closer look, one could see the subtle differences, the slightly softer facial features, the way his fingers flexed and moved with a human's dexterity, not a Zelari's rigid precision. And then there were his eyes, brilliant green, a color unheard of among the Zelari species, which typically bore red, yellow, or pale hues. Elias Harlan, or Ayla as he was known among the Zelari, kept perfectly still as the colony gates opened, and a patrol squad marched out. His gaze shifted, tracing each soldier's movements with predatory intensity. Though he had lived his entire life among the Zelari, treated as one of their own, he was all too aware of his true heritage. He wasn't a pure-blooded Zelari. He was the child of a human and a Zelari, the product of a forbidden union that his mother had hidden at great risk to herself. His fingers tightened around the small metallic object in his hand. A data crystal, smooth and dark, containing the final words and schematics left behind by his father. A father he had never met, a human engineer who had defied an empire with his cunning, a father whose legacy Elias was determined to honor. The crystal had been given to him by his mother, Saria, just before she was taken away by the High Command. They had found out about her secret. About him. She had given her life to ensure he could escape, to pass on his father's final plan. "This is your inheritance, Elias," she had whispered. Her voice choked with emotion as she handed him the crystal. "The key to everything your father fought for. The key to our freedom." He hadn't understood then. He'd been too young, too afraid. But over the years, as he had grown, and the crystal had revealed its secrets, the truth had become clear. The Solari had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now, with his father's designs, Elias held the power to strike back. "All units, prepare for deployment," a gruff voice barked from the comms of the squad leader below. Elias's attention sharpened. He recognized the insignia on the leader's armor, a high-ranking officer of the Zalari Navy, the perfect target. The patrol moved out, heading down the winding path toward the canyon's entrance. This was his chance. Moving like a shadow, Elias slipped down the rocky slope, his footfalls silent. He reached the path just as the squad passed beneath the overhang. A single, calculated leap brought him down onto the last soldier, his dagger flashing. The blade sliced cleanly across the Zalari's throat, severing the vocal cords before any sound could escape. The soldier crumpled without a sound, and Elias dragged the body into the shadows. The rest of the squad marched on, unaware of their missing comrade. One by one, he took them down, his movements swift and lethal. When only the squad leader remained, Elias stepped forward, the blade glinting under the moonlight. "Who?" the leader managed to cry out, but Elias was faster. He drove the dagger into the alien's chest, pinning him against the rock wall. The officer struggled, but Elias leaned in close, his green eyes glowing with cold fury. "Who am I?" he whispered. "I am the son of the man your people destroyed. I am the seed of humanity's vengeance." The officer's eyes widened in shock, and then recognition. Harlan?" he choked out, his voice strained. "Yes," Elias hissed. "Now tell me, where is the High Command stationed?" The officer's defiance melted under the intensity of Elias's gaze. He gasped, struggling to speak. It's the Nexus, the Grand Nexus, in the Andros sector." Elias's heart pounded. The Grand Nexus, the heart of the Zalari Empire, the seat of their power, where the highest-ranking leaders gathered. "Good," he murmured. "Then I know where to start." With a swift motion, he twisted the blade, ending the officer's life. As the body slumped to the ground, Elias retrieved a small comm device from the corpse. He glanced around, ensuring no one else was watching, before slipping back into the shadows. The Grand Nexus. It was a heavily fortified stronghold, surrounded by fleets and legions of Solari warriors. But Elias was no ordinary soldier. He was his father's son, trained to be both a warrior and a tactician. And he had something none of the Solari could comprehend, an understanding of their greatest weaknesses, built into the very ships and weapons they relied on. They had thought themselves invincible, untouchable. But that arrogance was about to be their downfall. 1 week later, en route to the Andros sector. The stolen Zalari stealth ship drifted silently through the void, its cloaking systems engaged. Elias sat in the cockpit, studying the swirling patterns of hyperspace beyond the viewport. The data crystal sat on the console beside him, its surface glowing faintly as it processed the new information he had gathered. He had spent years biding his time, collecting every scrap of intelligence he could about the Zalari fleet. With the data he had now, the pieces were finally coming together. The weaknesses his father had built into their ships were subtle. Microscopic flaws in the structural integrity. Tiny disruptions in the power grids that could be triggered with the right frequency. Alone, they were almost undetectable, but coordinated correctly. He allowed himself a grim smile. One ship could destroy an entire fleet. One act of sabotage could cripple their greatest strongholds. And with the Grand Nexus as his target, he would bring the Empire to its knees. "System coordinates locked," the ship's AI announced in its cold, mechanical voice. "Approaching the Andros sector." Elias's gaze hardened. This was it. He had no reinforcements, no backup, just a single stolen ship, the knowledge his father had died for, and the burning desire for revenge. The Zilari had destroyed Earth. They had enslaved him, taken his mother, and treated him like an animal. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had let him live. "Prepare for deployment," he ordered, his fingers flying over the controls. "It's time to finish what my father started." The ship shuddered as it exited hyperspace, the Andros sector stretching out before him. Vast warships, massive orbital stations, and the looming silhouette of the Grand Nexus filled his view. It was a sight that would have cowed any other, but Elias felt only a cold, savage satisfaction. "Grand Nexus," he murmured, "I'm coming for you." With that, he engaged the ship's thrusters and plunged into the heart of the enemy stronghold. The Grand Nexus of the Andros sector gleamed like a monstrous jewel in the darkness of space. It was a vast, multi-layered construct of alloy and energy fields, bristling with defensive arrays and shipyards that stretched out in a sprawling web. The Zilari called it the Crown of the Empire, a fortress said to be impregnable, defended by the most powerful fleet ever assembled. But Elias Harlan knew the truth. He knew that beneath the shining facade lay the subtle weaknesses, hidden vulnerabilities that his father had designed. With the right push, even the strongest empire could crumble, and Elias was ready to push. The stolen Zilari stealth ship drifted silently into the outer perimeter, cloaked and undetected. Elias's fingers flew across the console, his heart pounding as he brought up the security feed. Dozens of warships patrolled the perimeter, their massive forms casting long shadows over the smaller craft darting between them. The outer stations were teeming with activity. Dockworkers, pilots, soldiers, all moving with the eerie precision that defined the Zilari. Elias took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. One wrong move, and he would be vaporized before he could even scratch the surface of this fortress. But he had spent his entire life studying Zilari systems, learning to think like them, to act like them. "I'm not like you," he muttered, eyes narrowing as he adjusted the ship's frequency modulator. "But I know you." With a flick of a switch, he activated the comm array, sending out a pulse-coded signal. The response came almost instantly, a brief flicker on the display, followed by a stream of encrypted data. Elias's jaw tightened. It was a challenge code, the kind used by internal security. "All right," he murmured, fingers flying over the keyboard. He adjusted the ship's identifiers, aligning the digital signature with that of a Zilari patrol vessel. His heart raced as the console beeped in confirmation. Authorization granted. Proceed to docking bay 12. A surge of relief flooded through him. He was in. The stealth ship drifted forward, gliding past the outer defenses. Elias's gaze flicked between the monitors, tracking the movements of the patrols as he slipped through the maze of ships and stations. Docking bay 12 loomed ahead, a massive hangar lined with troop transports and armored carriers. His target. Elias's fingers tightened on the controls. This was the easy part. The real challenge lay within. With a hiss of hydraulics, the stolen ship touched down on the deck, its landing gear clamping onto the docking bay floor. Elias took a deep breath, steadying himself. He slipped on the helmet of a Zilari commando, a trophy taken from one of his victims. It fit snugly, the internal systems humming to life as it synchronized with the bay's network. He opened the hatch and stepped out, his heart pounding. The hangar was vast, filled with rows of transports and the distant thrum of machinery. Zilari soldiers moved in tight formations, their armor gleaming under the harsh lights. Elias kept his head down, blending into the stream of technicians and officers moving through the bay. His helmet's internal display flickered, highlighting key points of interest: the power conduits, the fuel lines, and most importantly, the access terminal linked to the Nexus's central core. "There you are," he murmured under his breath, his gaze locking onto the terminal across the hangar. It was guarded by a pair of Zilari officers, their massive forms towering over the smaller technicians around them. He would need to get past them first. He moved slowly, blending into the crowd as he made his way toward the terminal. His heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained calm, his movements steady. To the Zilari, he was just another soldier, another cog in the great machine. But they didn't know what he was carrying. Hidden in his belt pouch, shielded from scanners, were the detonator and the override codes, the final pieces of his father's plan. With these, he could trigger a cascade failure in the Nexus's power grid, sending a surge of energy through the core. It would disable the entire station, leaving it vulnerable to a full-scale attack. And if his father's schematics were accurate, it would also set off a chain reaction that could destroy every battleship docked in the sector. Elias's jaw tightened. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for his entire life. He reached the edge of the crowd, slipping into the shadow of a massive fuel container. The guards at the terminal were talking quietly, their attention focused on a data pad between them. Perfect. With a smooth, practiced motion, Elias reached into his belt, pulling out a small metallic sphere. A pulse grenade, short-range, non-lethal, designed to knock out electronics and stun anyone within a 5-meter radius. Just a little distraction, he murmured, priming the device. He tossed it. The grenade arced through the air, landing between the guards with a soft clink. They barely had time to react before it detonated, releasing a burst of electromagnetic energy. The lights flickered, and the guards staggered, their systems shorting out. Elias moved. He darted forward, slipping past the stunned guards and reaching the terminal in a heartbeat. His fingers flew over the controls, inputting the override codes with practiced precision. The console beeped, then flared to life, the display lighting up with schematics and data streams. Come on, he muttered, his heart racing. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. He could feel the eyes of the soldiers around him, the suspicion building as they recovered from the pulse grenade's effects. Then the display flashed green. Authorization complete. Got you, Elias breathed, a fierce smile spreading across his face. He reached into his pouch, pulling out the detonator. A single press of the button, and the entire Nexus would be plunged into chaos. A single press, and the Zalari would finally pay for what they had done. But just as his thumb hovered over the button, a sharp mechanical voice rang out behind him. Freeze! Elias whirled, his heart lurching. A squad of Zalari commandos stood at the entrance to the bay, their weapons leveled at him. Their leader, a tall figure in obsidian black armor, stepped forward, his gaze burning with suspicion. You! The commander growled, his voice like gravel. Step away from the terminal. Elias's mind raced. He could take down a few soldiers, maybe even escape. But if he ran now, he would lose his chance. The Nexus would tighten its defenses, and his father's plan would be for nothing. He couldn't let that happen. With a deep breath, he turned slowly, raising his hands in mock surrender. I'm just doing some routine maintenance, he said lightly, a smirk tugging at his lips. But I'll step back, if you want. The commander's eyes narrowed. Identify yourself. Elias's smile widened. With pleasure. And before the commander could react, Elias hit the detonator. The hangar exploded in a blinding flash of light. The blast rocked the entire hangar, a massive shockwave of force and energy that sent Zalari soldiers and technicians sprawling. The overhead lights flickered and died as the terminal's core exploded in a shower of sparks, and the massive bay doors buckled under the pressure. Chaos erupted as alarms blared, the high-pitched wail echoing through the chamber. Elias hit the ground, rolling to his feet amidst the confusion. The stun grenade had given him a few precious seconds, but he knew it wouldn't last. He had to move. Secure the intruder, the Zalari commander roared, his voice cutting through the din. The soldiers around him scrambled to obey, their movements jerky and uncoordinated as they tried to recover from the blast. Elias didn't give them a chance. He lunged forward, his plasma blade igniting with a crackling hum. The first Zalari barely had time to raise his weapon before Elias was upon him, the blade slicing through his armor in a clean, upward arc. The soldier crumpled, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. Elias spun, his eyes blazing. The remaining guards hesitated, their weapons wavering as they faced the lone human standing amidst the wreckage. For a moment, silence hung in the air, broken only by the crackle of sparks and the distant rumble of explosions. Who are you? One of them stammered, his voice trembling. Elias's gaze hardened. I'm the son of Elias Harlan, he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And I'm here to finish what he started. Before they could react, he surged forward, his blade flashing in a blur of motion. The soldiers fell one by one, their armor useless against the plasma's searing edge. In seconds, it was over. The hangar was silent once more, the only sound the faint hiss of Elias's blade as he deactivated it. He stood amidst the bodies, his chest heaving. He didn't feel the rush of victory or the satisfaction of a job well done. There was no time for that. He had set off the detonator, but the real work was just beginning. The entire station would be on high alert now. He had to reach the core, disable the power grid and trigger the chain reaction before the Zalari could regroup. If he failed, everything his father had sacrificed would be for nothing. Gritting his teeth, Elias turned and sprinted toward the main access corridor. The hangar was already starting to shudder as secondary explosions rocked the outer hull, sending showers of debris raining down from above. The corridor loomed ahead, a long, dimly lit tunnel lined with armored bulkheads. "Come on, come on," he muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. The station's security grid would be coming online any second now. He had to move fast, had to stay one step ahead. A flash of movement caught his eye. He dove to the side just as a plasma bolt sizzled through the air, scorching the wall where his head had been a moment before. Elias rolled to his feet, his blade igniting in a blaze of light. A squad of Zalari commandos blocked the corridor, their weapons leveled. At their head stood the commander, his armor scorched and battered, but his eyes burning with rage. "You'll pay for that, human," the commander snarled, his voice a low, guttural growl. Elias didn't hesitate. He charged. The corridor erupted into chaos. Plasma bolts ricocheted off the walls, filling the air with the acrid stench of ozone. Elias ducked and weaved, his blade a blur of motion as he deflected the incoming fire. The Zalari soldiers pressed forward, their weapons blazing, but Elias was faster, more agile. He darted between them, his blade cutting through armor and flesh with ruthless precision. But there were too many. For every soldier he took down, 2 more seemed to appear, their weapons spitting death in all directions. Elias's movements became more frantic, his strikes more desperate. He could feel the heat of the plasma bolts searing past his skin, the shock waves of near misses rattling his bones. The commander laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You can't win, human," he taunted, his voice echoing down the corridor. "You're outnumbered, outmatched. Surrender now, and I might let you live." Elias gritted his teeth, his eyes blazing. "Not a chance!" he snarled. With a roar, he threw himself forward, his blade slashing through the commander's guard. The Zalari staggered back, surprise flickering in his eyes as Elias's blade pierced his chest. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The commander stared at him, disbelief and fury mingling on his face. You! He gasped, his voice a broken whisper. Elias leaned in, his gaze cold. "This is for my father," he whispered. With a savage twist, he wrenched the blade free. The commander crumpled, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. The remaining soldiers hesitated, their weapons wavering as they stared at Elias in shock. For a moment, silence reigned. Then slowly, they began to back away, fear flickering in their eyes. Elias didn't give them a chance to retreat. He lunged forward, his blade flashing. The soldiers fell back in disarray, their formation breaking as they scrambled to escape. Elias pressed the attack, his strikes relentless, his movements a blur of motion. Within moments, it was over. The corridor was littered with the bodies of the fallen, the walls scorched and blackened. Elias stood amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving, his blade still glowing with the heat of battle. But there was no time to celebrate. He turned and sprinted down the corridor, his heart pounding. The core chamber was just ahead, a massive, reinforced chamber at the center of the station. If he could reach it, if he could disable the grid. A blinding flash of light erupted ahead, and Elias skidded to a halt, his eyes widening in shock. A massive figure stepped out of the chamber, its form towering and menacing. Its armor gleamed with a dark, oily sheen, and its eyes burned with a malevolent light. "Human," it rumbled, its voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "You've caused enough trouble." Elias's heart lurched. He knew this figure, the warlord of the Zalari, the supreme commander of the fleet. the one who had ordered Earth's destruction. For a moment, fear washed over him. This was the enemy who had taken everything from him. The one who had crushed his father's resistance, who had destroyed his home. But fear turned to resolve, burning hot and fierce in his chest. "I'm not done yet," he growled, his blade flaring to life. The warlord's lips curled in a cruel smile. "Then come," he purred, his voice dripping with malice. "Let's see what the last human is capable of." Elias's grip tightened on his blade. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then, with a roar of defiance, he charged. Elias launched himself at the warlord, his plasma blade blazing as he swung in a wide arc. The warlord moved with a speed that belied his massive size, his arm snapping up to block the attack. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed, the air crackling with energy. "You're quick, human," the warlord snarled, his voice a deep, guttural growl. "But you'll have to do better than that." He shoved Elias back with a brutal surge of strength, sending the human staggering. Elias gritted his teeth, his boots skidding across the metal floor. The warlord loomed over him, a towering figure of muscle and malice, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. But Elias didn't back down. He darted forward again, his blade flashing in a rapid series of strikes. The warlord parried each one with ease, his movements smooth and controlled. Elias pushed harder, his strikes growing faster, more desperate. He feinted left, then spun right, his blade slashing in a blur of motion. The warlord grunted as the plasma blade scored a shallow cut across his arm. Dark, viscous blood oozed from the wound, but the alien merely chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Impressive," he growled, "but futile." With a roar, he swung his massive arm in a wide arc. Elias ducked, the blow whistling over his head, but the force of the warlord's strike sent a shockwave rippling through the air. Elias stumbled, his balance faltering, and the warlord seized the opportunity. He lashed out, his fist slamming into Elias's chest with the force of a freight train. Pain exploded through Elias's body as he was lifted off his feet and hurled across the chamber. He crashed into the far wall, the impact driving the breath from his lungs. Stars danced in his vision as he struggled to rise, his limbs trembling. The warlord advanced, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Your father was the same," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Arrogant, defiant, but in the end, he broke. Just as you will." Elias's vision swam, his body screaming in agony. But even through the haze of pain, a fierce determination burned in his chest. "I'm not my father," he gasped, forcing himself to his feet. The warlord's smile widened. "No," he agreed softly. "You're weaker." With a roar, he lunged, his blade arcing toward Elias's throat. But Elias was ready. He ducked low, his movement swift and precise. The warlord's blade whistled past him, and in that split second, Elias struck. His plasma blade slashed upward, the glowing edge biting deep into the warlord's side. The alien let out a bellow of pain, his massive form jerking back as dark blood sprayed across the chamber. "You!" he snarled, rage twisting his features. But Elias didn't let up. He pressed the attack, his blade flashing in a relentless flurry of strikes. The warlord staggered under the onslaught, his movements growing sluggish as blood poured from his wounds. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "You can't win!" he roared, his voice edged with desperation. Elias's eyes blazed. "I already have!" With a final savage strike, he drove his blade into the warlord's chest. The alien's eyes widened, shock and fury mingling in their depths. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, the warlord's massive form crumpled, collapsing to the floor in a heap of twisted metal and bleeding flesh. Silence fell over the chamber. Elias stood over the fallen warlord, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion. He stared down at the alien, his mind racing. He had done it. The warlord was dead. But the battle wasn't over. The station was still active, its systems still online. If he didn't trigger the chain reaction soon, the Zalari fleet would regroup, and his father's sacrifice would have been for nothing. Gritting his teeth, Elias turned and sprinted toward the central control console. The terminal glowed softly in the dim light, its surface covered in alien symbols and blinking indicators. Elias's fingers flew over the controls, his movements swift and practiced. He had studied this system for years, had memorized every function, every command. He knew exactly what to do. With a deep breath, he entered the final sequence. The terminal beeped softly, and the screen flickered. A low, ominous hum filled the air as the station's core began to destabilize, its energy levels spiking rapidly. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the numbers climb higher and higher. 30 seconds. 20. 10. The station shuddered violently as the core reached critical mass, the entire structure groaning under the strain. Elias took a step back, his eyes fixed on the console. He had done it. The chain reaction was irreversible now. In a matter of seconds, the entire station would go up in a blaze of energy and fire. And with it, the Zalari fleet. A fierce smile tugged at Elias's lips. "For Earth," he whispered. The floor beneath him buckled, a massive shockwave ripping through the chamber. Alarms blared, and the walls began to glow with a blinding, white-hot light. Elias turned and sprinted toward the exit, his boots pounding against the metal floor. He could feel the heat of the explosion at his back, the air shimmering with energy. But he didn't stop. He reached the emergency escape pod just as the core detonated, the blast wave tearing through the station with a deafening roar. The force of the explosion hurled the pod away from the wreckage, sending it spinning wildly through space. Elias clung to the controls, his knuckles white. The pod tumbled end over end, the stars blurring outside the viewport. For a moment, it seemed as though he would be lost. Another casualty in a war that had claimed so many. But then, slowly, the pod's stabilizers kicked in. The spinning slowed, then stopped. Elias sagged back in the seat, his chest heaving, his heart pounding. He had done it. He glanced back through the viewport, his eyes narrowing. The Zalari station was gone, a massive cloud of fire and debris expanding through the void. The remnants of the fleet drifted in disarray, their formations shattered, their ships crippled. They would never threaten Earth again. Elias closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He had avenged his father, had struck a blow for humanity. But more than that, he had fulfilled a promise. To himself, to his people, to the memory of a world that would never be forgotten. And now, at long last, he could rest. The stars blurred outside the viewport as the pod drifted through the void, a lone figure amidst the wreckage of an empire. Humanity's vengeance was complete.